In the aftermath of Julius Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE, Rome trembled in uncertainty. The dagger wounds still fresh on the Ides of March had not only slain a man, but fractured the Republic into 1,000 pieces. Senators who believed they were rescuing liberty quickly discovered they had unleashed chaos instead. In the vacuum of power, two figures began to rise above the turmoil, their names soon to be etched into history as the fiercest rivals of their age. Marcus Antonius, Caesar's loyal general and friend, and Gaius Octavius, Caesar's young and unexpected heir. Between them stood not only a contest for power, but a struggle for Rome's very destiny, a clash that would decide whether the Republic lived or died, whether freedom could be reclaimed or empire was inevitable. Mark Antony was no stranger to war or politics. He had fought by Caesar's side in Gaul, shared in his triumphs, and stood with him against Pompey at Pharsalus. His reputation was that of a soldier first, brave, reckless, charismatic, and larger than life. Yet beneath the confidence, Antony carried flaws that made him both magnetic and dangerous. He was indulgent, prone to extravagance, a man of passions as much as ambition, and in Rome's fractured world, his enemies could use these flaws as weapons against him. Octavian, by contrast, was a figure of contrasts and surprises. Barely 20 years old at the time of Caesar's murder, frail in health, unknown to most of Rome's power brokers, he seemed an unlikely heir to the most powerful man in the Republic. But Caesar had seen something in the boy: intelligence, cold determination, and a calculating mind beyond his years. In his will, he named Octavian his son and heir, an act that transformed the youth into a political force overnight. Many dismissed him as too inexperienced, a child playing at politics, but they underestimated the steel beneath his soft voice and sickly frame. In Octavian burned a relentless ambition, cloaked in caution, yet willing to strike when the moment demanded. When Caesar fell, Antony sought to control the legacy of his dead leader. He seized Caesar's papers, treasures, and will, hoping to place himself as the natural successor. Antony spoke at Caesar's funeral, delivering one of the most powerful orations in Roman history, turning the crowd against the assassins and unleashing riots that set the city ablaze. For a time, Antony seemed unchallenged, master of Caesar's memory, the only man strong enough to avenge his friend. But in the shadows, Octavian was preparing his own rise. Octavian returned from Apollonia, where he had been studying and preparing for a military career under Caesar. Upon hearing of his adoptive father's death, he moved swiftly to claim his inheritance. Though young, he showed remarkable cunning. He approached Caesar's legions, invoking not only the dead general's name but also his blood, for through adoption, he was now Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus. Many soldiers who had fought under Caesar viewed the youth with curiosity, and some with skepticism. Yet Octavian's persistence, his promise to honor Caesar's legacy, and the legitimacy of the will gave him credibility Antony had not expected. Their first encounters were tense. Antony regarded Octavian as a nuisance, an impudent boy unworthy of Caesar's mantle. He underestimated him, seeing in him no rival but a youth to be brushed aside. But Octavian, careful and patient, understood that Antony's disdain could be turned into advantage. He built alliances quietly, cultivating support among senators who feared Antony's strength, among Caesar's veterans who longed for recognition, and among the Roman people who craved stability. Slowly, the boy began to stand taller. The assassins of Caesar, Brutus, Cassius, and their allies, watched with unease as Antony and Octavian maneuvered against each other. For them, the growing rift between Caesar's heirs was an opportunity. If they could exploit the divide, perhaps they could preserve the Republic. But Antony and Octavian, despite their mistrust, would soon recognize a deeper truth. Before they destroyed each other, they must first destroy the murderers of Caesar. Out of necessity, the two men formed an uneasy alliance with Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, a wealthy and powerful statesman, creating the Second Triumvirate. Bound by oaths of vengeance and convenience, they unleashed a reign of terror across Rome. Proscriptions swept the city, lists of enemies marked for death and confiscation. Senators and equestrians were hunted, their wealth seized to finance armies. It was blood for politics, a grim echo of Sulla's earlier purges, but now carried out in Caesar's name. Even Cicero, the great orator and defender of the Republic, fell victim to the triumvirs. Antony had long hated him, and when Cicero's name appeared on the list, Octavian, despite admiration for the statesman, did not intervene. Cicero's head and hands were nailed to the rostra, a symbol of how far Rome had descended into brutality. For a time, Antony and Octavian stood side by side. Their armies marched eastward to confront Brutus and Cassius, the last defenders of the Republic. At Philippi in 42 BCE, the two forces clashed in a bloody and decisive battle. Antony proved the stronger commander, defeating Cassius in the first engagement. Brutus held out longer, but eventually, surrounded and betrayed by fate, he too took his own life. The cause of the assassins was extinguished. Yet victory only deepened the fault lines between Antony and Octavian. With Brutus and Cassius gone, the common enemy that bound them had vanished, leaving nothing but ambition and suspicion between them. The triumvirs divided the Roman world. Antony took the wealthy provinces of the east, Octavian the war-torn but vital west, and Lepidus was left with the scraps of Africa. From this moment, the seeds of Rome's deadliest rivalry began to grow unchecked. Antony embraced his new role in the east, establishing himself as a monarch-like figure in the wealthy cities once ruled by Alexander the Great. There, he met Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, and their union would ignite scandal and reshape the course of Rome. To his supporters, Antony was the rightful heir of Caesar, continuing his vision of conquest and grandeur. To his enemies, he was falling under the spell of a foreign queen, abandoning Roman virtues for luxury and decadence. Meanwhile, Octavian labored to secure his position in Italy. He promised land and rewards to Caesar's veterans, though such promises stirred unrest among farmers and citizens forced from their land. He crafted an image of himself as the defender of Rome's traditions, the guardian of Caesar's legacy, yet distinct from Antony's excesses. Where Antony appeared larger than life, Octavian appeared disciplined, pious, a man of destiny chosen not by indulgence but by fate. Step by step, he transformed public opinion, presenting himself as the protector of Rome against Antony's growing eastern ambitions. The alliance that once avenged Caesar was dissolving into rivalry. Antony's charisma and military might clashed against Octavian's cunning and political genius. Each knew that Rome could not be shared, that the Republic, or what remained of it, could not tolerate two masters. From Philippi onward, the world moved steadily toward a reckoning, a confrontation that would determine not only which man would rule, but whether Rome would remain a republic or become something far greater and far darker. As Octavian strengthened his grip on the west and Antony bound himself to Cleopatra in the east, the stage was set for a conflict more brutal, more decisive than any civil war that had come before. It was no longer a question of coexistence. Rome itself demanded a single ruler, and the gods, as if watching from the heavens, prepared to cast their lot with one man, while consigning the other to tragedy. And so the rivalry deepened, no longer a mere struggle of politics, but a war of visions, of identities, of Rome itself, of Rome. The uneasy balance that followed Philippi could not last. Though Antony and Octavian had shared the triumph of crushing Brutus and Cassius, their alliance was held together by nothing more than necessity and fragile circumstance. With the Republic's last defenders dead, they no longer had a common enemy. Only ambition remained, and in the arena of Roman politics, ambition could not be shared. Each man understood what the other represented. Antony, the great general who had fought beside Caesar, carrying the aura of military command and the loyalty of veterans, Octavian, the legal heir, the adopted son whose cunning and calculated patience made him a master of maneuver in the Senate and in the hearts of the Roman people. Rome was too small for both. Antony's decision to linger in the east after Philippi sowed the first seeds of division. For some, it was a practical choice. The east was rich with treasure and fertile lands, capable of funding armies and rewarding soldiers. But for Antony, it was also a stage upon which he could reimagine himself, not merely as a Roman magistrate, but as a figure on par with the kings of old. It was in Tarsus that Antony encountered Cleopatra, the Queen of Egypt. And from that moment their fates were bound together in a drama that would fascinate the world for centuries. Cleopatra was no ordinary monarch. A woman of intelligence, charisma, and political brilliance, she had already secured her throne through careful alliances with Caesar himself. To Antony, she represented both opportunity and danger. Her wealth and influence could fuel his ambitions, but her presence also tied him to the east in ways that distanced him from Rome. When Antony summoned Cleopatra to answer accusations of aiding Cassius during the civil war, she arrived not as a supplicant, but as a queen in splendor. Her barge glided along the Cydnus River, its sails of purple billowing, oars of silver flashing, and musicians playing as though Venus herself had descended. Antony was captivated, and what began as politics quickly transformed into passion. Together, Antony and Cleopatra forged a partnership of power and love, one that scandalized many in Rome. To his soldiers, Antony remained a great commander, but to his enemies, whispers grew louder. He was bewitched, enthralled by a foreign queen, betraying Roman virtues for Eastern luxury. Octavian, ever the opportunist, recognized the potency of this narrative. Where Antony sought to rule through strength and charisma, Octavian mastered the subtler art of image and perception. He crafted a vision of Antony as a man corrupted, abandoning Rome for Egypt, squandering his honor on Cleopatra's indulgence. The seeds of propaganda began to sprout, and in the minds of the Roman people, Antony was becoming not a rival, but a threat. Yet for a time, the fragile peace was held together by political necessity. To maintain the alliance, Antony married Octavia, Octavian's sister, a union meant to symbolize reconciliation and unity. Octavia was noble, virtuous, a woman who embodied Roman ideals, and for a brief moment it seemed as though the bond between the two men might hold. But Antony's heart remained in Egypt, with Cleopatra, and his absence from Rome deepened suspicion. When he returned to the east and resumed his life with the queen, Octavian seized the opportunity to portray Antony as faithless, not only to his wife, but to Rome itself. Meanwhile, Octavian worked tirelessly to consolidate his position in the west. Italy was restless, veterans clamored for land, and the dispossessed cried out in anger as farms were seized to reward soldiers. Octavian endured uprisings, revolts, and dissent, but each time he emerged stronger. He quelled resistance not only with force but with promises, with calculated gestures of clemency, and with an unrelenting focus on appearing as the protector of Roman tradition. In the Senate, he cultivated allies who feared Antony's growing power, painting himself as the lesser of two dangers. The rivalry began to take shape as more than personal ambition. It became a clash of visions. Antony, draped in the magnificence of the East, seemed to embrace a role beyond Rome, presenting himself as a successor not only to Caesar but to Alexander the Great. He distributed kingdoms among Cleopatra and their children, granting them lands that once belonged to Rome's enemies. It was a gesture of dynastic ambition, a dream of empire that blended Roman power with Eastern monarchy. To Antony's supporters, it was bold, visionary, a new world in the making. To Octavian, it was treachery, a betrayal of Rome's very essence. Octavian's genius lay not in battlefield glory, but in the manipulation of symbols and perception. He obtained a copy of Antony's will, or claimed he had, and read its contents to the Senate. Whether genuine or forged, the effect was devastating. According to the document, Antony wished to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra, not in Rome among his ancestors. He had legitimized the children he had fathered with her, elevating them above Roman citizens, granting them kingdoms as though he were a king himself. For Romans who valued tradition, these revelations were scandalous, proof that Antony no longer served Rome, but Egypt. Octavian had framed the conflict not as a struggle between two Roman leaders, but as a battle between Rome and a foreign queen, with Antony as her pawn. By the late 30s BCE, the die was cast. The second triumvirate had collapsed into suspicion and rivalry. Lepidus had been pushed aside, his role reduced to irrelevance, leaving only Octavian and Antony. Their enmity grew sharper with each passing year, and the propaganda war reached fever pitch. Antony's supporters accused Octavian of deceit and treachery, of using Caesar's name for his own gain, of masking ambition beneath false modesty. Octavian countered with relentless portrayals of Antony as a traitor enslaved by Cleopatra. Rome itself was divided, senators and citizens forced to choose sides in a conflict that seemed inevitable. When Antony returned to the east in 36 BCE, he launched campaigns against the Parthians, seeking to rival Caesar's great conquests. But fortune did not favor him. His army suffered in the harsh terrain, and though he escaped disaster, the campaign lacked the triumph he had promised. His failures weakened him, and Octavian seized the chance to remind Rome of who truly protected her. Through carefully crafted messages, Octavian painted Antony's ventures as reckless, draining Rome's strength for Cleopatra's ambitions. It was in this crucible of suspicion, propaganda, and ambition that the final war began to take shape. Antony and Cleopatra, bound together by love and vision, stood as monarchs of the East, rulers who dreamed of a dynasty that could rival Rome itself. Octavian, cold, calculating, tireless, stood as the defender of Rome, champion of tradition, and avenger of Caesar's legacy. The Mediterranean world braced for conflict. Alliances shifted, armies gathered, fleets were built. It was no longer a question of whether Octavian and Antony would clash, but when. And as the year 32 BCE approached, the world seemed to hold its breath, as though the gods themselves were waiting to see which man would rise to mastery and which would fall into ruin. The rivalry had transcended mere politics. It was no longer Octavian versus Antony alone, but Rome versus Egypt, tradition versus decadence, destiny versus downfall. The stage was set for the last great civil war of the Republic, a war that would decide the future of the Mediterranean and echo across centuries as one of history's most dramatic struggles for power. By 32 BCE, the fragile balance between Octavian and Antony had collapsed beyond repair. What had once been cloaked in the language of alliance and necessity now stood naked as open rivalry. Each man knew that Rome could not endure them both, and the Republic itself seemed to demand a reckoning. The tension that had smoldered since Philippi now burst into flames, and the final war of the Roman Republic began to unfold. Octavian moved first, not with legions but with words. He understood that before swords could be drawn, loyalties had to be shaped, the minds of Rome molded to accept the war as just and necessary. With calculated precision, he unleashed a campaign of propaganda unlike any Rome had seen. Antony was no longer simply a rival. He was a traitor enthralled by Cleopatra, a Roman who had become less Roman than the Queen of Egypt. Octavian's rhetoric cast him as the defender of Italy, the protector of Roman traditions, the champion of Caesar's memory. Antony was the corrupter, a man willing to see Rome subjugated to Eastern monarchy. The turning point came when Octavian obtained Antony's will from the Vestal virgins. where it had been deposited for safekeeping. Whether genuine or forged, it mattered little. When its contents were read before the Senate, outrage swept through the chamber. Antony, it seemed, had not only granted kingdoms to his children by Cleopatra, but had also requested that his body be laid to rest in Alexandria. To Romans who revered their ancestors and the sanctity of burial in their homeland, this was an unthinkable betrayal. Octavian's enemies accused him of violating sacred oaths by revealing the will, but the damage was done. The Senate recoiled in horror, and Antony's image was irreparably stained. The Senate, swayed by Octavian's relentless campaign, declared war not on Antony himself, but on Cleopatra. It was a masterstroke. Octavian had framed the conflict not as a civil war, which Rome dreaded after decades of bloodshed, but as a foreign war against an alien queen threatening the Republic. By directing the declaration against Cleopatra, he allowed Antony's supporters to cling to the illusion that Rome was united, even as legions prepared to fight one another. Octavian now stood as the savior of Rome, the man who would defend her against the seductions of the East. Antony, for his part, was not idle. In the East, he and Cleopatra marshaled vast resources. Egypt's wealth flowed into their coffers, fleets were built, armies raised, and allies courted. Antony's vision was nothing less than an empire of East and West united, ruled not by the fractured institutions of the old republic, but by dynastic monarchy. His proclamation of the so-called donations of Alexandria, in which he distributed territories to Cleopatra and their children, was a bold assertion of this vision. But in Rome, it was seen as proof of his betrayal. Where Antony saw himself as heir to Alexander the Great, the Senate saw only a Roman general, enthralled by a foreign queen. The Mediterranean braced for war. Fleets assembled in harbors, soldiers drilled under burning suns, and spies carried whispers across the seas. The tension was not only political, but deeply personal. For years, Octavian and Antony had measured themselves against one another, each aware that the other was the final obstacle to absolute power. Their rivalry had become mythic, two destinies hurtling toward collision, and all of Rome watched with dread and anticipation. In Italy, Octavian's grip tightened. He settled veterans with promises of land and reward, ensuring their loyalty even at the cost of unrest among the dispossessed. His propaganda machine painted Antony as a deserter of Roman values, a man who feasted in Eastern splendor while Rome bore the burdens of his ambition. Octavian himself, despite frail health and lack of military brilliance, projected the image of discipline and piety, a man chosen by the gods to protect the Republic. He cast himself as Caesar's true heir, not by blood alone, but by virtue and destiny. Antony, in contrast, leaned into the magnificence of the East. With Cleopatra by his side, he cultivated the aura of a living god, a new Dionysus and Isis ruling together. In Alexandria, processions of grandeur and lavish ceremonies displayed a vision of power far beyond the Senate-esque crumbling dignity. To his supporters, this was greatness, a new order rising from the ashes of the old. To his enemies, it was decadence, the betrayal of everything Rome had fought for. The clash between them was no longer only about armies or politics, it was about identity, about what Rome itself was meant to be. The summer of 32 BCE became a fevered rush toward confrontation. Octavian secured control of the Senate, forced Antony's supporters to flee east, and declared himself protector of the Republic. Antony, in turn, gathered his legions and fleets, anchoring his forces in Greece, where he prepared for the decisive showdown. Cleopatra brought the full weight of Egypt's resources, her ships sleek and swift, her wealth limitless, her influence over Antony complete. The east and west of the Mediterranean were now arrayed against each other, the world trembling at the scale of what was to come. In the midst of these preparations, omens and prophecies swirled. Rome had always looked to the gods for signs, and many saw in the heavens portents of what was to unfold. A comet had blazed across the sky years earlier, interpreted as Caesar's soul ascending to the heavens, a symbol Octavian had used to sanctify his cause. Now, whispers spread that the gods favored Octavian, that Antony's bond with Cleopatra was cursed, doomed to end in tragedy. The war was becoming not just a political struggle but a cosmic drama, the fates themselves deciding which man was worthy of Rome's destiny. By 31 BCE, the stage was fully set. Antony and Cleopatra's forces gathered at Actium, a narrow gulf on the western coast of Greece, while Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant admiral Agrippa, closed in. The world held its breath as the two greatest armies and navies Rome had ever assembled faced one another. It was the culmination of decades of civil war, the final struggle of the Republic, a conflict that would decide not only who ruled, but what form Rome would take in the centuries to come. The war was no longer a struggle of politics or even of personal ambition. It had become a war of worlds, of identities, of destinies. In Antony and Cleopatra stood the grandeur of Eastern monarchy, dazzling but alien to Roman tradition. In Octavian stood the cold discipline of Roman order, calculating, unyielding, determined to bring unity at any cost. Between them lay the fate of the Republic, of Rome, and of history itself. The fleets drew closer, the soldiers sharpened their swords, and across the Mediterranean the people waited. The gods, it seemed, had brought the world to this moment. The clash of Octavian and Antony was no longer merely inevitable. It was ordained. The summer sun beat down upon the waters of western Greece, and the world's greatest fleets prepared to meet in battle. It was September of 31st BCE, and all eyes turned to the narrow gulf of Actium. Here, destiny would be decided. The armies of Rome and the wealth of Egypt had been drawn into a single confrontation, where two men, Octavian and Antony, staked not only their lives but the future of the Roman world. Antony commanded a formidable force, his fleet numbered around 500 ships, many of them massive multi-decked war galleys bristling with soldiers and siege engines. They were floating fortresses, imposing and powerful, yet cumbersome in the narrow waters of the Ionian coast. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, stood by his side with her own fleet of 60 ships, sleek and well-manned, their golden prows glimmering beneath the Mediterranean sun. Together, their forces seemed invincible, a display of power and wealth that dwarfed anything Octavian had yet commanded. Octavian's fleet, commanded by his brilliant admiral Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, was smaller, numbering around 400 ships. But what they lacked in sheer size, they made up in maneuverability. Agrippa had outfitted his vessels with lighter hulls and superior rams, designed not for endurance, but for agility. His strategy was not to outmuscle Antony, but to outmaneuver him, to choke and wear down the larger, slower galleys until their sheer bulk became their undoing. On land, Antony's forces held strong positions, with vast armies encamped near the shore. For weeks, the two sides maneuvered without striking, locked in a stalemate as disease and hunger began to gnaw at Antony's troops. Octavian's fleet, supplied by the surrounding countryside and secured by Agrippa's mastery of the seas, harried Antony's supply lines, cutting off reinforcements, sowing desperation in the enemy's camp. Time was on Octavian's side, and Antony knew it. Within the walls of his command tent, Antony faced a fateful choice. His officers urged him to withdraw to Egypt, to preserve his forces for another campaign, rather than risk all upon a single naval battle. Others urged him to march his legions inland, to force Octavian into a land engagement where Antony's soldiers, seasoned veterans, might carry the day. Yet Cleopatra insisted on a naval confrontation. Her fleet, her treasure, her pride were all bound to the sea. Whether from strategy or from her influence, Antony resolved to stake everything on the waters of Actium. The morning of battle dawned bright and clear. The sea shimmered, calm but heavy with expectation, as Antony's great fleet pushed out from the straits into open waters. His ships formed a crescent, stretching across the gulf, their sheer size a wall of wood and bronze upon the waves. Octavian's smaller ships hovered at a distance, cautious, waiting, their sails trimmed, their crews disciplined. At the center of it all, Agrippa watched with cold precision, calculating every movement. As the fleets drew closer, the air filled with the sounds of drums and horns, the shouted orders of captains, the creak of oars cutting through the sea. The clash began with a thunderous impact, rams smashing into hulls, grappling hooks flung across decks, soldiers leaping aboard to fight hand to hand. Antony's great ships loomed like giants, but their bulk made them slow to respond. Agrippa's nimble galleys darted in and out, striking and retreating, severing oars, splintering timbers, leaving the massive vessels stranded and vulnerable. The battle raged for hours. Smoke curled into the sky as ships burned, men screamed and clashed, the waters turned red with blood. Antony himself fought bravely, directing his forces, urging them to press forward, to break Octavian's line. For a time, the outcome hung in balance, the clash of two titans grinding against one another, neither side yielding. And then, in a moment that would echo through history, Cleopatra's fleet broke from the line. 60 Egyptian ships unfurled their sails and fled southward, cutting through the chaos of battle and racing for the open sea. Whether by prearranged plan or sudden panic, the Queen of Egypt abandoned the fight. Antony, seeing her sails vanish toward the horizon, faced a choice that would decide his fate. In that instant, love triumphed over duty. He broke from the battle and pursued Cleopatra, leaving his fleet leaderless, his soldiers stunned. The sight of their commander abandoning them shattered Antony's forces. Confusion spread, morale collapsed, and Octavian's fleet pressed the advantage. One by one, Antony's great galleys were surrounded, boarded, and destroyed. By nightfall, the waters of Actium were littered with wreckage and corpses. Antony's once mighty fleet was broken, his dream of victory sunk beneath the waves. Cleopatra's flight had transformed the battle from a contest of equals into a rout. Octavian, though cautious in pursuit, knew in his heart that destiny had shifted. The gods had spoken. The war was not yet over, but the outcome was now inevitable. Antony and Cleopatra reached Egypt, their fleets diminished, their armies demoralized. The dream of ruling the Roman world together, of forging a dynasty of East and West, lay in ruins. For Antony's soldiers who remained, hope faded. For Octavian, Actium was more than a victory. It was a turning point that elevated him from contender to master of Rome. The news spread swiftly across the Mediterranean. Cities and kingdoms that had once pledged loyalty to Antony now turned to Octavian, eager to secure favor with the man who would surely be Rome's ruler. The Senate, already bent to Octavian's will, declared him Rome's savior, the man who had defended the Republic against foreign corruption. His propaganda was vindicated in blood. Antony, once the hero of Caesar's legions, now stood as a broken man, defined not by his victories, but by his defeat and his love for Cleopatra. Yet the story did not end at Actium. Though Antony had fled, his armies remained in Egypt, and Octavian knew that until both he and Cleopatra were destroyed, his rule would not be secure. The war had been decided in essence, but the final act was still to be played out in the palaces and deserts of Egypt. In Rome, anticipation mounted. The Republic, weary of endless civil wars, yearned for closure, for the final end of the turmoil that had consumed it since Caesar's assassination. All eyes turned southward, toward Alexandria, where Antony and Cleopatra prepared for their last stand. The world sensed that the curtain was falling, that the fate of Rome, and perhaps the fate of history, was about to be sealed in tragedy and triumph. The gods, it seemed, had written the script long before. Actium had revealed their favor, but Egypt would be the stage upon which the final drama unfolded, a tale of love, betrayal, and death that would echo down through the ages. After the devastation at Actium, Antony and Cleopatra retreated to Alexandria, the jewel of Egypt, their fortunes shattered, but their pride unbroken. The city, with its labyrinthine streets and towering palaces, became a fortress of last defiance. Antony's army, diminished and demoralized, held what ground it could, while Cleopatra's treasures and fleets, once instruments of ambition, now served as symbols of survival. Yet within the grandeur of the city walls, a sense of inevitability hung in the air, heavy as the Mediterranean sun. Octavian, methodical and relentless, pursued them not with reckless haste, but with the precision that had marked his rise. His armies advanced across Egypt, securing towns, cutting off supplies, and presenting themselves not as conquerors, but as the ordained arbiters of Rome's destiny. For Antony and Cleopatra, each day brought shrinking options. Desertion weakened their forces, loyalty faltered, and hope became a fragile illusion. In private, Antony wrestled with despair and defiance. He had long been a man of courage, willing to face death on any battlefield, but the weight of failure pressed upon him. His vision of a shared Roman-Egyptian dynasty of East and West united under his and Cleopatra's rule lay in ruins. Still, he refused to surrender to Octavian, clinging instead to the only alternative left to him: death on his own terms. Cleopatra, equally proud and cunning, prepared for the possibility of a fate beyond capture. She, too, would not bow to Octavian's authority, nor would she allow her legacy and that of her children to be claimed by Rome. As Octavian's forces surrounded Alexandria, the city became a stage for desperation. Antony attempted a last sortie, a strike meant to test the Roman lines, to buy time, or perhaps to reclaim some measure of honor. But his army was exhausted, his men outmatched, and the effort failed. Antony returned to the palace, wounded in both body and spirit, and there he faced the unthinkable, the total collapse of his world. Cleopatra, ever resolute, assured him that if they were to die, they would do so together, masters of their own fate. In the days that followed, Octavian entered Alexandria without resistance. The city's defenders, weary and demoralized, offered little opposition. Octavian's forces marched through the streets, not as marauders, but as conquerors whose authority was now absolute. Cleopatra's palaces, once resplendent with wealth and power, were inspected, catalogued, and secured. Yet the queen remained elusive, her presence a final challenge to the young Roman's triumph. Antony, hearing of Octavian's approach and seeing his army surrender, understood that his time had come. Rather than be paraded in Rome as a captive, a spectacle of humiliation, he chose to end his life. In a moment of tragic resolve, he fell upon his own sword. Cleopatra, refusing to witness her lover's death without finality, prepared her own escape from the chains of fate. Using her knowledge of poisons and her cunning, she chose death in a manner befitting her majesty, silent, secretive, and defiant. According to legend, she allowed an asp, sacred to the goddess Isis, to bite her, ending her life with dignity and mystery. With the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra, the last remnants of resistance evaporated. Octavian, now unchallenged, faced a world that had endured decades of civil war, where loyalty was fragile and fear had ruled more often than law. Yet he approached his victory not with recklessness, but with calculation. He secured Egypt, its wealth, its grain, and its treasures, integrating the ancient kingdom into the Roman sphere, while maintaining Cleopatra's children under his control as wards of Rome. Rome itself transformed under Octavian's hand. No longer merely the city of senators and assemblies, it became the seat of a new order. Octavian did not declare himself king, for the Romans still recoiled at monarchy. Instead, he adopted the title Augustus, the revered one, a name that conveyed authority without directly invoking kingship. He presented himself as the restorer of the Republic, the guardian of Roman traditions. Yet beneath the ceremonial facade lay the absolute power of a single ruler. Through shrewd governance, he centralized control of the military, the treasury, and the provinces, ensuring that Rome would never again be threatened by the chaos that had consumed it during the civil wars. The transformation was both political and symbolic. Temples were rebuilt, statues erected, and coins minted bearing Augustus's visage alongside symbols of Rome's divine destiny. Octavian's propaganda emphasized stability, piety, and restoration, framing the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra as necessary acts to preserve Roman freedom from foreign corruption. For the people, weary from decades of strife, this narrative was persuasive. Rome began to accept that peace, even under the authority of one man, was preferable to the endless cycle of civil war. Yet the story of Antony and Cleopatra endured, immortalized in legend and memory. Their love, their ambition, and their tragic end became a cautionary tale and a source of fascination. A reminder that the stakes of power were not merely political but human, intertwined with passion, loyalty, and fate. In the palaces of Rome and the ruins of Alexandria, their story whispered across centuries, shaping the imagination of poets, historians, and emperors alike. Octavian, now Augustus, looked upon a world he had mastered, yet the lessons of his rise were clear. Cunning, patience, and the mastery of perception could achieve what armies alone could not. By neutralizing Antony and Cleopatra, he had not only secured power but also reshaped history. The Roman Republic, centuries old, had ended in the wake of rivalry, betrayal, and decisive action. From its ashes rose the Roman Empire, vast, centralized, and poised to dominate the Mediterranean for centuries to come. And so, the rivalry that had begun in the shadow of Caesar's death reached its tragic and inexorable conclusion. Antony and Cleopatra fell as both lovers and sovereigns, their ambitions eclipsed by Octavian's patience and strategy. Rome, weary of civil war and intoxicated by order, embraced a new era. The Republic was no more, but in its place, an empire endured, shaped by the vision of one man who had understood the delicate balance between power and perception, ambition and destiny. In the end, history would remember Octavian not merely as a victor, but as the architect of a new world. Antony and Cleopatra, for all their grandeur and brilliance, would live on as legends of love, ambition, and tragedy, a mythic counterpoint to the pragmatic genius who had conquered both them and history itself. The Mediterranean settled into a fragile peace, its shores now under a single authority, yet the echoes of rivalry lingered. The lessons of ambition, loyalty, and the consequences of defiance would resonate for generations, a reminder that power, once unleashed, could neither be shared nor contained. Rome had chosen its master, and the gods, it seemed, had indeed ordained the course of history.